Hey everybody, this is the second part of the P5 tutorial on the random tone generator that we are triggering with a toggle button. So here's the code I have from the last video. Right now this is just the sound part, and we're going to explore it using visuals. So just talk this through. I made a sound object with this ask variable. I created a toggle button here, so when I press one key it will start the oscillator, and then I press the same key it'll stop it. I used the new random function that we introduced in the last video and assigned it to a variable that would then change the frequency of my oscillator, and then I just slowed down the rate at which draw is updating so that the change in frequency isn't as garbled and quick, so it sounds a little clearer. So I will just click the canvas. Now I'm pressing my A button, and there we hear the sound of my random pitch generator. I press A again. Okay, so since it's P5, I want to play around with adding some visuals to go along with my random pitch generator. So I'm going to use this random function to do some random things with the visuals as well. Okay, I'm going to note here that a couple of the examples I'm going to do are going to make some quick flashing lights in the canvas, flashing lights and colors. So I just want to state that if you have any conditions that are relate to triggering seizures through these kind of things or something, be mindful that there are going to be like sort of quick strobing and flashing lights, and if that is an issue for you, then maybe you shouldn't watch this next part. And just for everybody out there, when we're developing projects or tools like that, it is always important to kind of consider what you're adding to your project that may have an effect on someone with some type of condition or disability. You always want to be mindful of those things when creating so that it can be accessible for everybody, or at least you aren't sort of putting people out by not letting them know what to expect, and you certainly don't want people to have some sort of problems or issues with your project based on a condition they have. So when we're designing projects, there's always something we want to keep in mind, is making it accessible and available for everybody. Okay, so in this example, I took pitch and made a variable and assigned it a random number. Now, I can just use the random function by itself without having to give a variable to it. So I'm going to do that here I'm going to make my background change to a random grayscale value every time it goes through draw and every time the pitch changes. So as an argument in background, I'm just going to write random, open close parentheses. So now I kind of have double parentheses here. And random can also take just one argument instead of two. Now when you give it one argument, that argument is going to be viewed as the maximum value with the minimum assumed to be 0. So if I just write, say, 255, which is the maximum grayscale value, it's going to choose a number between 0 and 255. So when we only do one argument in random, the minimum is assumed to be 0 and the maximum is whatever the number you put here. If you put two values, then the first value is the minimum, the second value is the maximum. All right, so I'm going to press play here and be aware the lights are going to start right away. So you can now see every time through draw, which I've set to 10 times a second, it's changing colors here in the canvas to some sort of grayscale value. Now this is not quite going along with my oscillator because it just started once the sketch started, not when I pressed the key. I never pressed the key and it was going. So I'm going to add one more thing. I'm going to add a conditional statement here in draw. I'm going to say if, open close parentheses, open close curly brackets. So if playing is equal to true. So this is only going to happen in draw if the playing variable is true, which happens when I press the key if it's set to false. And then I'm just going to take my background and put it into that conditional statement. So if playing is true, meaning I press the button when playing was not true or false, then it's going to make that background. Okay, so now I press play. We don't see anything, this because the background hasn't been made yet into draw. So I click where the canvas would be. Now I press A, and now I get that sort of flashing start. And now watch, if I press A again, it stops. Okay, I press it, and now it stops. And now it'll stop on whatever the last value was that before I pressed it again. Okay. Now maybe I want to not do black and white. I want to do some color. So I could change this to RGB values. So I'm just going to do a random for red, a random for green, and a random for blue. So now I press again. I'll click where the canvas would be. And now I have some color. Okay, so every time through draw, it's just choosing a random red, a random green, and a random blue. And I press A again, it will stop. I press it, I stop it, I press it, I stop it. All right, so that's one thing I could do. Now let's try something else. Let's say, I'm going to get rid of this background for a moment. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to paste it later. So let's say now I want to make an ellipse in a random place. So I'm going to write ellipse. Okay, open, close parentheses. Now remember, the first variable is the X position on the canvas. So I want that to be random, and I'm going to make it any random position between 0 and the width of the canvas. Remember, this width variable right now it's set at 400, but I can always change that. So some random variable in the width. Okay, now I'm going to, for the next argument, the random is going to be the Y position, so I'm going to make that height. So some random width and some random height. The next one would be the size of my ellipse. So I'm also going to do random, but this time I'm going to give it a minimum and maximum value, because if I do it just the minimum is 0, then sometimes I won't see my ellipse. I'm going to do it somewhere between 8 and 64 is that. Okay, now I'm getting a red here. That's just because I got to remember to close with an extra parentheses, so that's from the ellipse. So when you start using random inside of other functions, you might wind up running into some problems with the amount of parentheses that you have. So this parenthesis here is coupled with this one for the ellipse, and then these other sets of parentheses are for each random function. Okay, so now I have this random function or random values for this ellipse. So every time through draw, it's going to draw an ellipse somewhere on the canvas at a random X and Y and at some random size there. Okay, but I just need my background. Again, I'm going to go back to the default value here. So now I press it. So there's my canvas. I click on the canvas. I press my button. And now I just get these random circles being drawn all over. I stop. And it stops. I press it again, it goes, and I stop. Okay, so that's something I can do. Now I could also, I guess I can save it. So let's say I want a random color now. So I'm going to do a random fill. Okay, open, close, parentheses, and I'll just do random 255 again. So I'm just going to do these randoms for RGB values. I'm going to add one more parenthesis to close off my fill with this parenthesis here. So now I press it, and each circle not only has a random position and size, it has a random color to go with it. Right? So I got that. There's another thing I could do. So now I'm going to add one more interesting thing. I'm going to take this background and I'm going to take it out of draw and I'm going to put it into setup. So if you remember, backgrounds will constantly update in draw, which is why we can get these animations. But if you put background in setup, it'll make the background once, and then every time it draws something, that thing is just going to stay on the canvas. It's not going to disappear because the background isn't updating along with the rest of the animation you have. So if I do that, click the canvas, now all my circles stay on the canvas, so I can kind of create these cool patterns as I go. And I stop it, I start it, and it adds again. I stop it, I start it. So I can make some interesting random designs here, which is another way you could go. And there's so much you could do. You could change the size of the circle. You could add another value here so they're random, making ovals as opposed to just perfect circles. You could make rectangles. You could make triangles where all the points on the triangle are random. There's just so many options you can play around with this animation to go with this project. So one last thing I will add to this is I'm just going to take this background and I'm going to throw it into this part here. If when I'm playing and I stop it, I want it to set a new background. Okay, so that will clear, actually, yeah, that will clear the canvas every time I stop it. So I press it, get all my circles. I press it to stop, and it clears the canvas. I press it again, it makes a new design. I stop it, and it clears it. So you can try whatever you want with this random as far as other designs or drawings you want to happen with your random tone generator. It's really so much that you can do. Please share them with me. I'd love to see them. And that's all for this project. So we'll see you next time for a different P5 tutorial.